Hamza Yusuf Hanson is one of the leading Islamic thinkers and speakers in the Western world today. After converting to Islam at the age of 17, Hamza Yusuf studied with some of the most notable scholars in the Arab world for over a decade, receiving a number of teaching licenses in classical Islamic subjects. Following this, he returned to the US to earn degrees in healthcare and religious studies. His years of meticulous traditional study, intellectual rigor, and eloquence have placed him at the very forefront of Islamic intellectual discourse. In 1996, Shaykh Hamza co-founded the Zaytuna Institute in California, which has established an international reputation for reviving the study of classical Islamic studies in the West, and has since become America's first ever accredited Muslim college. As one of the most recognized and respected voices, Shaykh Hamza regularly delivers lectures at venues drawing tens and thousands of supporters. He has advised both the White House and the Arab League, and most recently was a guest speaker at Tony Blair's Faith Foundation. We're deeply honored to welcome Shaykh Hamza to the stage. Professor Ramadan is one of the world's foremost and renowned intellectuals in Islamic academia. Born in Geneva, he has a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies and received intensive training in classical Islamic scholarship at Al-Azhar University, Cairo. A senior research fellow at St. Anthony's College, he was appointed chair of contemporary Islamic studies at Oxford University in 2009. In addition to serving as president of the Brussels-based European Muslim Network, Professor Ramadan works as an expert in various commissions linked to the Brussels Parliament. He's also a member of several working parties throughout the world. Dubbed a Muslim Martin Luther, he has repeatedly been named as one of the most important contemporary intellectuals of our time, including by the British Prospect and American Foreign Policy magazines. Time magazine also recognized him as amongst the 100 most important innovators of the 21st century. He has advised numerous Western governments, including the American administration, the British government, and recently the French government, and has written more than 20 books. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, and peace and prayers be upon all of the prophets of God and upon our Prophet Muhammad. Alhamdulillah. I'm going to try to address each one of these points that I've been asked to address, but before that, I'd like to preface my remarks by talking about a specific problem that we have when we look at the Islamic tradition, when we look at Islam as a faith, and when we are addressing an audience that contains both peoples from the Islamic faith of various, obviously, types and backgrounds, and then of Western people. In science, you have what are called non-complementary paradigms. And to give an example of that, Newtonian physics is a certain way of viewing the world, and it works at a certain level. But if you attempt to apply Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics, it doesn't work. You have a non-complementary system attempting to address things that are very different and need a different language to describe them and a different theoretical basis to make sense of them. In many ways, the post-industrial, increasingly postmodern Western liberalism is akin to quantum mechanics, and the Islamic tradition is more akin to Newtonian physics. And so when the two of us attempt to talk, we're speaking completely different languages. And it really creates a massive barrier. Let me give you one example. One of the fundamental premises of the Islamic tradition is that human activity has metaphysical impact, that what we do in the world is actually reflected back to us through the world. So natural disasters are not seen as simply events that happen because of tectonic plate shifts, but there's actually a relationship between human behavior and between what is happening in the world. For many, many Western peoples now, that idea is a quaint, superstitious, historical idea from a previous time, something very difficult for Western people to actually relate to. One of the problems with that idea, however, and I do put this caveat, is that many Muslims will use that as a way of pointing the finger at people and saying, this is why it's happening. You're an evil person and therefore God is zapping you. That is also a major problem because there's nothing in the Islamic tradition that permits one to do that, because it is arrogating to oneself the judgment of God, and that's simply not in the realm of a human being to do. And so that's a very important point. Another aspect that is very difficult for, I think, Western peoples to relate to is the fact that the primary texts of Islam are 1,400 years old. And it is very difficult for Western people to understand how you can use a text that was written 1,400 years ago to have anything to do with modern legislation. This seems really quite incomprehensible for many people. And to give you an example, in the United States, we have a 200-year-old document. It's actually older than 200 years, but we have a document that is a little older than 200 years called the Constitution. It's the basis of our legal system. In the arguments that we have in the United States of America, we have arguments around what they call strict construction and loose construction, how we interpret the Constitution, originalism versus a living Constitution, the idea of what's called textualism in our tradition, intentionalism. What's the intent of the framers when they said these things? And should we base it on their intent, even though they were speaking 200 years ago in a very different context? Or is it a living constitution that can be reinterpreted based on the changes of time? The Founding Fathers didn't really leave a lot of explanation of how they wanted it to be understood, although there are some remarks. Thomas Jefferson said that you can't expect an adult to wear the coat of a child. And countries grow, and therefore our understanding will grow, and there needs to be changes. But he also said, but don't allow the Constitution to be wax in the hands of the government to where they can shape it to fit the way they want. This dilemma that exists in the United States is very similar to the dilemma that Muslims are going through today. There are many Muslims that are arguing for a living Quran, as opposed to a type of textualist approach or intentionalist approach to the Quran. How do we interpret the Quran in the light of modern society? Now, the reason that I really wanted to drive that point home is because the problems of law and language are perennial problems. We still study Plato because Plato raises questions that are still pertinent to people living today. We still study Aristotle because Aristotle also addresses issues that are pertinent to people today. And so, in light of looking at the past to illuminate the present, I would like to honor a graduate of Oxford and an Oxford Don who I really like. And that is the great Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee studied at Balliol College, and I'm speaking about Arnold J. Toynbee, not the great economist of the 19th century who also has that same name. Arnold Toynbee wrote an essay in 1947 called he wrote a series of essays in a book called Civilization on Trial. One of the things that he said in that book is that when civilizations are confronted with challenges, they tend to respond in different ways, and their responses will determine their success or their failures. But he said one of the common characteristics of a civilization when they're under great stress is to find what he called bugbears, people to blame for their problems. And he mentions now the capitalist West, it uses communism. He said in the divided world of 1947, communism and capitalism are each performing this insidious office for one another. Whenever things go awry in circumstances that seem ever more intractable, we tend to accuse the enemy of having sown tares in our field and thereby implicitly excuse ourselves for the faults in our own husbandry. This is, of course, an old story. Centuries before communism was heard of, our ancestors found their bugbear in Islam. As lately as the 16th century, Islam inspired the same hysteria in Western hearts as communism in the 20th century. It's very interesting in this same essay that he actually argues that Islam is also going to become a problem again. And he addresses what is very fascinating to me, the fact that Islam is up against the wall vis-a-vis Western civilization. And because it's up against the wall, it responds in one of two ways. He calls one of the responses Herodianism and the other Zealotism. Herodianism, he said, is mimicry. It's attempting to find the secret of the people that have conquered you and to become like them. This is the Japanese response to the post-World War situation, where the Japanese now have better rock and roll than the Americans. They can imitate Elvis Presley. Even their prime minister, when he came to America, he wanted to go to Graceland. That was the first place that he asked George Bush to go to, and he actually did go and visit because he apparently is a great fan of Elvis. They have some of the finest classical musicians. This is very common for conquered peoples to imitate those who have conquered them. This is why Native Americans are often the last people wearing cowboy clothes, literally wearing the Levi's and the cowboy. They will embellish it with traditional beads and things, but this is something that happens. But he says the other response is zealotism, which is an attempt to fall back on the past in this rigid, nostalgic structure. And he identifies three places where he feels that this will be the biggest problem for the West in dealing with the Muslims. Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. And it's quite stunning that he did this in 1947, and I would attribute that to the Oxford education. So we're looking forward to such prescient understandings of the future from these young Muslims that are coming out of here. But one of the things that he says is that the problem with Herodianism is that the mimicry is always pale imitation. They can never become really as good as those that they're trying to imitate. And he says the problem with zealotism is that it is invariably a dead end, and it comes to a failure. Now, in terms of looking at Islamic reform today, I have a problem with the word, and I clarified it with Dr. Ramadan, and the word that he understands reform is islah in Arabic, which is a good Arabic term. Islah is the idea of rectifying something after it's corrupted. And it's a good word because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ actually used that word when he said blessed are the strangers, and he was asked who the strangers were, and he said they are people who rectify my sharia, my way, after people have corrupted it. So he said, الَّذِينَ يُصْلِحُونَ الشَّرِيعَةِ بَعْدَمَا أَفْسَدَهَا النَّاسِ. The importance of that tradition is two things that can be immediately gleaned from it. One is that his sharia does get corrupted by his own testimony, that it can be misunderstood, it can deviate from its original intentions. But then the other thing is the need for people to rectify it, this islah, this idea of rectifying it. Now, the problem for me with the language reform is more of a Christian term coming out of the Protestant Reformation, which was a response to the abuses. And I know it's the most radical of the Protestant Reformation came out of Switzerland. So so Zwingli was actually more radical than Martin Luther. But the end was the banking state of Switzerland, and this is often the danger of reformations, because there's a wonderful statue of Calvin in Geneva, because the bankers loved the fact that the Protestants allowed for usury, whereas the Catholics opposed usury, and now we're living in a world that is economically disintegrating before our eyes because of this hegemonic banking madness that is so out of hand. But the idea of reform, of Islamic reform, is an old idea, and the idea of using a language that comes out of another set of historical problems, for me is problematic. My own teacher, Shaykh Abdullah bin Bay, when we spoke about this, I asked him, and he speaks French, and he knew he knows the history of the Reformation and the use of the term. And he said that he preferred the word renovation and used that as French because it's closer to the idea of tajdid. The idea of reformation, because reformation can be a complete restructuring of something. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, the idea is that the house is fundamentally of sound. It's of sound foundation, but it often needs renovating. It needs renovating. Sometimes the faucets aren't working anymore. The water's not flowing. People aren't getting fresh air because the windows can't be opened. So you need people to come in and renovate the house. And this is the idea. Now this process has been going on for centuries. There's an idea, what's wrong with the Muslims? Why won't they change? If you look at the Muslims today, the Muslims of the 19th century would not recognize the Muslims of today. The radical changes that have occurred in the Muslim world in the last 30 years, let alone the last 100 years, are beyond belief. If you look at Arabic culture, and the fact that MTV, that there is a Muslim version, not a Muslim, but an Arabic version of MTV, which is as racy as the MTV that people experience in the Western Hemisphere. Now, people like an Osama bin Laden, who turns that on and sees that, literally will pull their beards out because it's incredibly traumatic to see something like that happening in their culture. The Arabs pride themselves on what's called ghaira. In Urdu, it's translated as ghairat. Urdu people say that's where the Arabs got it from, but it's actually the other way around. Ghaira is the concept of, it's a type of jealousy. It's the idea of coveting something so much that you're willing to fight for it. And I don't think people in the West can really appreciate anymore the degree to which this virtue in Islamic and Arabic tradition is still upheld. I certainly believe that was a far more dominant virtue, say in the 19th century in the West, but it's certainly something, now it's a very much live and let live attitude. And there are reasons for that. 2 world wars in Europe have led to a certain way of looking at the world. The crises that happened in the West because of 180 million people dying. We tend to want the Muslim world to catch up with us. What's wrong with you? Why can't you catch up with us? And yet we don't realize that we have been through, in the West, so much trauma to get to this point that we're at. And the Muslim world had a different set of historical traumas, much of it, in fact, a result of colonialism. So we have very different historical circumstances. Now, in terms of what is legitimate renovation or tajdid, I would argue that the Islamic tradition is a vast tradition. The Islamic tradition is largely unread. Even people now that are studying in madrasas, studying at Sharia colleges, do not go deeply into this tradition. This is simply a fact. One of the things, I'll give you one example. When I wrote a paper on female prayer, because this was an issue a few years ago, years ago when I was a student in Mauritania, I remembered in a book that Ibn Ayman from the Maliki madhab considered female prayers was permissible in that madhab. And I remember as a 21-year-old student underlying that. I actually went back to the book and found my underlining that statement. When I studied the prayer issue, I was so struck by the fact that not only was it debated early on, but there were multiple opinions. Imam Tabari considered it permissible for women to lead the prayer if they were more qualified than men, to lead men in prayer. Ibn Taymiyyah himself permitted women to lead men in prayer if they were illiterate and she was literate. He just said she should lead from back because she might distract the men if she was leading from the front. Ibn Taymiyyah permitting a woman to lead men in prayer. Right? I mean, this is the tradition. It's all there. People have no idea how many of these issues were already examined, discussed, and incredible erudition and energy went into this. So if you look, I would argue that the Islamic tradition has within itself all of the needs to renovate the house. But it's going to take an immense amount of intellectual energy. It's going to take very, very highly qualified people, which necessitates institutions that can train and produce the types of people that are needed to engage in this activity. Usul al-fiqh is one of the great, which is in essence, it's the philosophy of legislation in the Islamic tradition. Much of the Quran and the hadith is in fact closer to what we would call constitutional law in the West. It's not statute law. The Prophet ﷺ gives far more constitutional expressions and legal injunctions than he ever gives cut and dry statute law. Do this, don't do that. He leaves things open. There's an immense amount of ambiguity in the hadith. This was known early on. There are very few verses of the Quran and hadith that are considered what is known as qat'iyyat al-dilala, which is where the understanding of the expression is absolute, that we know exactly what it means. It often holds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 meanings, and you get all of these multiple interpretations. The other thing that's so extraordinary about our early scholars is that they were very well aware of what we would call in the West fallibilism, that they were not dictating God's law in their jurisprudence. They were dictating the mujtahid or the individual's understanding of God's law. In fact, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in has a chapter entitled The Prohibition of Calling a Fatwa the Ruling of God. The prohibition of calling a fatwa the ruling of God. The fatwa is a personal opinion of a mujtahid in attempting to understand the intention of a text. Moreover, the fatwa was known and understood to be specific, in many cases, to time and place. This is another aspect of fatwas that are rarely understood, even amongst people that are trained in classical Islamic education. The Hanafi school believes that the place actually affects the ruling, even though the other three schools do not in the Sunni tradition. So if you're in England, there are certain rulings that would be permissible here that might not be permissible in another place. Other scholars argue no. But these are the differences of opinion and the nuances. This is another aspect. The Muslims have always recognized diversity and difference of opinion. But we have what are called thawabit and mutaghayyirat in our Islamic tradition. The thawabit are things that do not change. They cannot be reformed. One of them is our basic understanding of God, our basic understanding of prophecy, our basic understanding of eschatology, of what happens after life. These things are fixed and eternal. They don't change with time and place. God is all-powerful, omniscient. He speaks, and he has no gender, even if we use gender language to express the divine by the limitations of language. But Muslim theologians were always clear, there is no gender to God. God is neither male nor female, transcendent. So that aspect cannot change. What changes then? The changes are our understandings. But those understandings have to be based on following rigorous principles. The first and foremost is they have to be within the context of the language in which the revelation was revealed. And this is why, as opposed to living constitution, the idea that the language and the intent of the framers of the Constitution have no relevance to us today. This is a debate. This is a very important departure for the vast majority of Muslims with certain reformist movements today. The idea that somehow we can reinterpret the Quran in the light of 21st century language. The Quran was written in Arabic of the 7th century. That Arabic was preserved to a degree by which only people who really have studied this tradition understand. It is one of the great human achievements, the preservation of the Arabic language, the exact meanings of every single word that is recorded in the Quran, of all the words that are recorded in the Hadith, and having to prove what those words mean. And on rare occasion, saying we can't ascertain the exact meaning of this word or the multiple possible meanings, like the word ib, which is in Surah Abasa. So the Muslims, jurists, traditionally believed that you could not go outside of the language. You were confined by the language. Now, the other aspect of this, which is very important, is they were always aware of the ambiguous nature of language. The Quran is open to multiple interpretations and multiple meanings and will be until the end of time. Verses can be reinterpreted in the light of new knowledge and have and will continue to be. So the Islamic reform or tajdeed that's happened in the past, we have many examples of that. But I would look at a few that occurred in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, with the colonial incursions, there became a response to the Western colonization of the Muslim countries. Some of those responses involved attacking Muslim spirituality because they believed, like Muhammad Abdu and others, they believed that the Muslims were far too otherworldly, that the Sufis had taken hold of their understanding to such a degree that they really forgot about the world itself. And so the emphasis then was to focus on the political, the economic dimensions that had been ignored for so long. And so you got these reformist movements that were essentially political and economic attempts at redressing the real problems in the Muslim world, educational problems, the fact that things like engineering were so widely ignored, attempting to redress the problems of Muslim universities. Al-Azhar is a good example of that. Al-Azhar was traditionally only where people were trained in Islamic tradition, and now it is a multidimensional, multifaceted university. That was an attempt at reforming the problem of limiting Islamic universities simply to the subjects of Islamic tradition. Then you had the political movements of which Dr. Ramadan's grandfather was involved in on his maternal side, Hassan al-Banna, who was part of that tradition of Rashid Rida, who was also one of the reformist trends that occurred in the Muslim world. Ben Badis, who is affected by that in Algeria, so you have a complete reformist agenda in Algeria, and then you have Ala al-Fasi in Morocco. These are all happening on top of the Wahhabi reformist movement that was happening even earlier than that in the 1780s, 1790s, and then it's reinvigorated with King Abdul Aziz's conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. These are all attempts at reform, of dealing with the collapse of the Muslim sovereignty and the Muslim ethos. One of the great traumas of the Muslim world was in 1924 when the Ottoman Caliphate officially dismantled. There was a conference in Mecca that was done to reestablish it, to appoint a new caliph. The head of that conference was Muhammad al-Zawahiri, who was the grandfather of Ayman Zawahiri, the companion of Osama bin Laden. He was the Sheikh al-Azhar at the time. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. Ayman Zawahiri's grandfather on his maternal side wrote the Egyptian constitution. He was one of the most important people in designing the Egyptian constitution. He comes from a very traditional, very aristocratic Egyptian family. So what happened between Muhammad Zawahiri and Ayman Zawahiri? I mean, how did that chasm occur to where you end up responding instead of the famous statement of Muhammad Zawahiri in 1924, after they couldn't elect a caliph in Mecca, he said, let's do the janazah prayer over, which is the funeral prayer of the Muslims, over the nation of Islam. That was Muhammad Zawahiri, his grandfather's response to the inability to elect a caliph. Now, what's happening now as you get this extraordinary postmodern environment that we're in now, where the internet has opened up all of this extraordinary exchange of ideas, and you have many Muslims that have migrated to the West, have imbibed Western liberalism, have imbibed many of the concepts of the West. They're struggling. There is a lot of soul searching going on. We have, for instance, gay and lesbian people in the United States, and I'm sure here, but in the United States, we have gay and lesbian people who are born into Muslim families that want a gay and lesbian Islam. They want an Islam that is big enough to include the gay and lesbian community. And so there's a movement now there. You have people like Irshad Manji, who is also calling for this reform. The misunderstanding, I think the trouble with Islam today, becoming a spokesman for a certain type of progressive movement. The question is, why is there so much distrust and trepidation by the Muslim grassroots? I would say the fundamental reason is because Lord Cromer, and I don't know if he went to Oxford, but Lord Cromer, who was the governor of Egypt, a close friend of Muhammad Abdu's, said, a reformed Islam is not Islam. And I would argue that that is true and that's not true. It's true in that the fundamental thrust of Islam is that it was a reformist movement to begin with. Islam was redressing the problems that they saw inherent in Christianity, the sectarianism. People have no idea the number of sects of Christians that existed in the Middle East at that time. The Nestorians, the Jacobites, the Arians, the Byzantine Orthodox, the Catholics, all of these different groups. The Malibari Nasranis, who are still in existence in India, had to flee to India, who were Semitic Christians like Ebionites. All of these differences. And then also the Jewish rejection of Jesus. So the Prophet Muhammad saw himself as coming to really reform the Abrahamic tradition. He put in place several constraints in his faith. And also in the Quran, you will find many verses warning not to change the faith. There are many warnings about this. The Prophet, one of the most fundamental concepts in Muslim consciousness is the idea of bid'ah, is the idea of innovation, of changing the structure of things. And this is why the Muslims are very, very wary of messing with the calibration of this religion. This is why when they see new ideas like this, they tend to react. This is the grassroots of Muslims. This, I do not believe, will change for any time soon. I really don't. I think that you will find, and in the Muslim world, this is particularly acute, far less so here. I think Western Muslims are extremely tolerant of many divergent opinions. Even the spectrum of our understanding is quite broad, and what we allow to go under the umbrella is much broader than in many places in the Muslim world. Not all places, but in many places in the Muslim world. But the Muslims historically have been very tolerant of dissent. Now, there is an argument here about British Islam, and I want to talk about that and then make my closing remarks. There's an argument somehow that the British Muslims need to assimilate. They need to fully become British. And there's this problem with multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is threatening the cohesion of our society. I'm amazed at the idea of cohesion. I'd like to see it, where all this wonderful cohesion is. I think people that are in their 70s in this room can remember how cohesive neighborhoods were 60 years ago, 70 years ago. They're much less so today, and I'm old enough to remember how my neighborhood was and how my neighborhood is today. So we have social fragmentation is a problem everywhere. Now, the argument that America, and I find it extraordinary that Brits will tolerate this from your politicians, the argument of saying, look at America, how cohesive they are. They all pledge allegiance to the flag. You know, they have Thanksgiving. You know, everybody has a national turkey day. And, you know, why can't we have a national pheasant day? Or maybe that's too upper crusty. Maybe a national shepherd's pie day, you know. So, I mean, what's fascinating to me about this is, first of all, America has always been a multicultural society. We have never been a cohesive society. We have people in America that speak their own forms of English. Really. And British people would say we all speak our own form of English in America. But, you know, look, we have people, I can't understand them. We have a language called Ebonics. We have a gumbo language, fiddle-eye and a gumbo pie and a filet gumbo. For tonight, I'm going to see my Mashera Mio. I mean, do you understand that? I don't understand. It's a Hank Williams song, I mean, he knew what it was about because it's a Louisiana dialect. I don't know what it is. And I'm sure you've got people up in Yorkshire that you can't tell what they're saying. But look, the reality of it is, America, we have people in America driving around in buggies. In buggies. They're debating whether or not to put rubber tires on those buggies. That's what they're debating in their community. And I'm not making this up. America we have places in my state that says, se habla inglés. That means we speak English here. I'm not making this up. We have 7th generation Chinese in San Francisco, Chinatown, that do not speak English. They have been in the United States for 7 generations. This is America. So this idea, this fantasy that some of these British politicians have of bringing this wonderful, cohesive America over here, good luck, my friends. Seriously. But one of the things I love about England is that you've always tolerated eccentric uncles. Why can't you tolerate eccentric religions? Really? I mean, what's so wrong with that? This country was forged in religious wars. Religious and tribal wars to a certain degree. It was forged in that. You learn the lessons of those wars. Britain is one of the most tolerant places in the world. It really is. And like Dorothy Sayers, one of my favorite theologians, she's a mystery writer too, but she was also a good theologian. Dorothy Sayers said, the British people are slow to anger, but when they get angry, they behave like fools. And there's probably a lot of truth in that, but the fact that they are slow to anger, that's one of the most precious virtues in Islamic tradition, hilm, which is the ability to forbear others, to be slow to anger. In terms of what role should governments play in Islamic reform, I mean, I would argue that governments are one of the most important things that Muslim jurists attempted to address was the limits of government. And Muslims traditionally were very libertarian in their approach. They did not like, our jurists did not like, they didn't work for governments. And we had a separation of powers in the sense that the legislative body was in the jurists, and the jurists were independently working. Islamic Sharia arises completely independent of government support. The great jurists were actually Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, all spent time in government jails. All of them. And these were the great founders of the Sunni tradition, and the Shia also have a tradition of persecution at the hands of government as well. In some ways, far worse than anything the Sunnis ever suffered. So Muslim jurists were always very wary of government. One of the things about that, nothing taints a reputation more in our community than an association with a government. You lose your credibility. When I went into the White House, and I was just a guest, they didn't pay me, I didn't get any money. Maybe I should have asked for something because it was just, but that did more to tarnish my reputation amongst a large segment of the Muslim community, because Muslims are very wary of any scholar who associates closely with the government, and they always have been. And there's a reason for that, because governments never do that out of the graciousness of their goodwill. They co-opt. And when George Bush made a reference to "we're not at war with Islam," the CNN camera immediately flashed on me, which made me realize that was pre-planned. So we do have a state press. They called it Pravda in Russia, we call it CNN. But these are the problems that we have to deal with. Now, our Prophet said the worst scholars are those at the doors of rulers, and the best rulers are those at the doors of scholars. My own teacher, Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya, said the first is restricted, and the second is absolute. What that means in usuli language is that the first is not an absolute statement, because it's dependent on the intention of the scholar. When the Prophet said the worst scholars are those at the doors of the governments wanting some personal gain from them. If they go there for the sake of God to advise those governments, then they're not from amongst the worst scholars. This is the type of understanding that needs to translate. Finally, in conclusion, I would argue that some of the most important things that have to take place in the UK and in the United States and really in Europe. We have now 30 million Muslims in Western Europe, according to most statistics. We have probably between 6 to 10 million Muslims in the United States. We have about 3 million Muslims, I think, in Canada, and maybe 2 million in Canada. But we have close to 500,000 in Toronto. They make 10% of the population in Toronto. In Philadelphia, America's first capital, we have 10% Muslims now. In New York City, the Eid the City Council of New York voted to make the Eid holiday a holiday in the city of New York, largely because 12% of Muslim children in the New York City School District are Muslim. 12%, that's the largest city in the United States of America, and 12% of its children in its public school system are Muslim. This is an immense opportunity, but it's also a crisis. And we know that in the Chinese ideogram means both crisis and opportunity. It's a crisis because if we don't somehow come to terms with the fact that Muslims do not have the intellectual tools to navigate their religion in uncharted waters, such as these that we are in now, if these tools are not presented in an intelligent way that's rooted and founded in the Islamic tradition, then we have a very serious problem. And this problem, right now, we're only seeing slight externalities. And I'll use that term externality, as you know, is a negative externality of a corporation is the toxic byproducts that come out of it. So like BP, the positive thing was drilling the well. The negative externality is the fact the well didn't work out. Well, religions have negative externalities as well. Things go wrong. People go wrong. We have Muslims that are negative externalities for the social body. Now, people leave it up to BP to deal with the problem, but sometimes the problem is bigger than BP. Sometimes you do need governments to come in. When the FBI came to me, not to question me, they never came to question me. I mean, they have at the airport and things, but they never came to my house to question me like was reported in the press. And Dr. Ramadan knows about press. I don't believe press anymore, because once you read about yourself in the press, you know it's just rubbish. You know. And Wikipedia, my goodness, you know. So the FBI, I told them, look, my wish, you know, really, my wish is you guys get it right. Really. This is a criminal problem. These are criminals, and they need to be stopped. Extremism is as American as apple pie. We have extreme sports. We jump off buildings, you know, with bungee ropes and things. We have extreme eating. We had a woman die recently in a water drinking contest. We have hot dog contests where they eat 150 hot dogs. People from Egypt would never do that. You know, we have extreme music. They used our music to torture people at Guantanamo Bay. Seriously, they used it to torture. In fact, the heavy metal bands actually protested against their music being used as torture. We have extremism is as American as apple pie, really. The problem is not extremism. Extremism is a human problem, but it's always been there. It will always be there. The problem is violence in a civil society. And this is what we need to address, the problem of violence. And at essence, Islam is an Iranic religion. It is a peaceful tradition. Our Prophet was not a warmonger. He did not like war. He disdained war. He said, never hope to meet your enemies. But if you're forced to meet them, be brave in the battlefield. He prohibited the killing of civilians. He prohibited the killing of women and children. In the Maliki fiqh that I studied, the only time that you can fight a woman if she's a combatant on the other side. The Maliki jurists were so troubled by the hadith that they said, if you see a woman on the battlefield, run away from her. Because they did not want you to fall under that hadith, because it's a mutawatir hadith, it's a factual hadith that has the same strength as a verse in the Quran. Now, I want to close and end this by saying one of the greatest problems we have is we have what I call Sheikh Googles, weekend muftis. We have now a loss of authority in our tradition. This has led to people like what they call Shaykh bin Laden. Somebody called me up on a recent Arabic program and said, what do you think of Sheikh Osama bin Laden? And I just said, first of all, what do you want from the question? Do you want me to be, if I answer, oh, he's a great guy, to be in Guantanamo Bay tomorrow? I mean, is that kind of the idea? Or what, you want, I think he's terrible. But who made him a sheikh? Really, who made Sheikh Osama bin Laden a sheikh? Osama bin Laden is an accountant. Ayman Zawahiri was a pediatric surgeon. And these people are giving fatwa from caves in Afghanistan telling people to kill people. Now, their fatwa is based on a famous fatwa from Mardin. The fatwa that killed Anwar Sadat is the same fatwa. My sheikh and teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, recently held a conference in Turkey in the city of Mardin, which is where the fatwa was addressing an issue in that city. The fact that the ruler of that city was a Muslim but not applying Islamic law, and he was under the influence of the Mughals who were not Muslim at that time. He was asked, is this an abode of war or an abode of peace? He said, it's neither one or the other. It's a hybrid, because it doesn't have the qualities of the abode of war, it doesn't have the qualities of the abode of peace. And then he said something very interesting. He said, therefore, the believer should be treated in accordance with the fact that he's a believer, and the disbeliever should be fought. يُقَاتِلُ الْخَارِجُ عَنِ الشَّرِيعَةِ بِمَا يَسْتَحِقُ. The disbeliever should be fought because he's left the Sharia and as he deserves to be. Now, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, when that fatwa was read in Mardin, he said that can't be right, the text. The ulama that were in the audience, some of them, some of the biggest ulama in the Muslim world, all said, Sheikh, don't change the fatwa. It's Shaykh al-Islam's fatwa. We can address the problems of the fatwa, but don't change the text of the fatwa. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya insisted. He said, no, something is wrong with that text. It doesn't work in the Arabic language like that. When he got back to Jeddah, he went to another text and found that it did not say that the one who left the Sharia should be fought. It actually said, instead of yuqatilu, it said yu'amalu. He should be treated in accordance with him being a disbeliever. In other words, there are many rules that relate to disbelievers. Then he asked for the oldest copy in the Zahiriya Mektaba in Damascus, and it came back saying, in fact, that he should be treated, not killed or fought. That fatwa was published 100 years ago and has been replicated in countless editions of his fatwas saying that they should be fought. That is the basis of Abdul Salam Faraj's fatwa to kill Anwar Sadat. It was the basis of bin Laden's fatwa to kill the Americans and also to overthrow the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. It's a misprint. They've based an entire philosophy on a misprint in a text that occurred 100 years ago. This is a crisis in our community, the crisis of authority. Who can read these texts and who can determine what they mean? Thank you very much.